Hello everyone, my name is Oscar and this is Hollywood Underwater. Now today we're going to take a look at the origin of underwater filmmaking. It was 1914 and we get our first images underwater. And that story actually begins with an old sea captain who was born in the 1800s. I mean, he had nothing to do with cinema, he had nothing to do with photography, but it was his invention that basically leads the first person to be able to go down and get underwater footage. So Captain Williamson, who is this shipwreck salvager, thinks about a way that he can actually get into the water and look at the wreck that he's going to be working on, but without having to, put on one of these unwieldy dive suits that they had back in the day, and also to, have to risk life and limb just to get under there to see what he's going to be working with. So basically, he comes up with this pretty ingenious idea. Now we'll take a look here at the Library of Congress site where they have a description basically of Charles Williams' invention. It was a deep sea tube made up of a series of concentric interlocking iron rings that stretched like an accordion. So now at the base of this tube was a compartment. So this was all one piece. You would crawl through it from within the ship down into this tube, down to the compartment by which he had lowered, right, because it's sort of this accordion effect thing. So he can lower this thing, goes down to the bottom of the surface, and all he has to do is climb in, go down, and look out the porthole, right? It has a little porthole, a window, and now he can see the wreck that he's going to be working on. So that was basically an invention he came up with and was perfectly suitable for photography or filmmaking, which, of course, in 1912, his own son, John Ernest Williamson, who was a budding journalist at the time, kind of realized that there was this obvious opportunity for him to do this. So that's exactly what he did. In 1912, he went down, took a few stills, and then realized that he could actually do some motion picture filming, and that was going to be pretty groundbreaking at the time, especially since cinema was so young. And so that's what he did. In 1914, he set up a shoot, which he would go down and get the world's first underwater motion picture imagery. Now that film was actually lost for about 100 years up until 2010 when it was discovered and then eventually released publicly, and we get to see what this footage was. Now, a word of caution here about the unfortunate content of the film. Showmanship and exploitation were basically the theme of the day, and Williamson was basically as guilty as anyone else back in the day. To get eyes on his film, he pitched it as man versus shark. This would sort of guarantee that investors would invest in funding for this production, and so he would actually go down into the water. He would bait this innocent shark with a dead horse of all things, and kill it with a knife. And of course, back in the day, that was sort of this, self-promoting showmanship kind of thing that was expected to sell at the box office, and that's exactly what it did. Here's another entry from the Library of Congress site about John Williamson. J.E. Williamson's career is emblematic of a period in filmmaking long past when pioneers were part scientist, part showman, and part promoter on endeavors that involved as much adventure as technology, and I would add again, brutality. But ultimately, his film did succeed in breaking new ground. There's this uncredited article here in 1914 that calls out sort of this new genre in filmmaking. The secrets of the ocean deep are secrets no longer. The moving picture man and his camera have invaded the depths where only finny creatures have gone before. His footage clearly made an impact in Hollywood, and they came calling big. In 1916, Universal Pictures actually hired John Williamson and his brother George to provide the footage for a big underwater adventure. And of course, at the time, the most obvious choice for this film was going to be Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And the studio didn't spare any expense. They literally had a budget of $500,000, $500,000 in 1914. I looked it up. The translation to today's purchasing power is over $13 million. So they did go all in, and they even had this full-size movie set of a submarine built for the production. Now, the film itself was released with opening credits as usual, and I mention that because as you see right after they credit the director Stuart Payton, it was followed by sort of this unusual announcement. The submarine scenes in this production were made possible by the use of the Williamson inventions and were directed under the personal supervision of the Williamson brothers, who alone have solved the secret of under the ocean photography. What about Dad, right? It was his invention. Anyways, regardless, it was such an important feat that the studio wanted to ensure that the audience knew that they were about to see real, true life underwater imagery. And of course, that was going to be the hook, right? So they had to announce it before the film actually began so people knew what they were getting into. Now, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, of course, which was a novel written 1870 by Jules Verne, was actually the perfect story to use and introduce the underwater footage through cinema. In the story, the famed submarine's Captain Nemo takes his guests to a window, the submarine porthole basically, and in the film he has them sit just like a movie audience theater would to essentially screen what people had never seen before, and he announces it by opening his magic window, and in the next frame his guest and us, the viewing audience, will finally get to see the true images of the undersea world. Now, that film went on to make over $8 million, huge success, and it was basically the beginning of undersea films. And that photosphere, which is what he called that contraption, was what was used to get real underwater footage to insert into movies for the next quarter of a century. So it wasn't until 1939 that Hans Haas was able to be the first filmmaker that took a camera, stuffed it in a housing, and just went free diving and went underwater and started getting, what would be now a new style of underwater imagery, because you weren't stuck inside a compartment looking out of a window. So it just grew and grew, and it became more and more exciting and dazzling to the audiences, which is why we still have films being made today. James Cameron's Avatar sequels filmed mostly underwater, superhero movies, and just your action thriller. It's just a constant slew of these films that are being shot underwater, and there are tanks in studios being built around the world because it is in demand. People like it, it entertains, and so I think that we're going to see a lot more of underwater filmmaking as the years go by, and I think it's going to get just that more impressive. So that was it. That was the origin of underwater filmmaking. I hope you enjoyed this brief deep dive into the origins of underwater filmmaking. Please subscribe. My name is Oscar, and thank you for watching Hollywood Underwater.